Hello and welcome to another Turnstile Tour virtual program. My name is Stephen D.W. and I'm speaking to you from Flushing, Queens. Today we're going to talk with Tim Roth from the New Jersey Canal Society about the Morris Canal, one of four canals that served New York directly or indirectly, including the Erie, the Delaware Hudson, and the Delaware and Raritan canals. And the Morris Canal, especially a significant one, both in terms of the culture of New York and the technology developed in the canal. And of course, in just a moment, we're going to learn some great stuff. So I'd like to invite Tim Roth to join us from the New Jersey Canal Society, the Canal Society of New Jersey, and tell us all about the Morris Canal. Hello, Tim. How are you?
Hi, Stefan. How are you? Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, who joined today.
Well, it's a real pleasure. Folks may have gathered if you've seen previous programs with me. I'm a big fan of canals generally, and I grew up near the Lehigh Navigation and the Delaware Canal, and could wave from my hometown of Easton, Pennsylvania, to the gates at the Morris Canal, the remnants of the Morris Canal there in Phillipsburg, New Jersey. So this is a story I care about a great deal, and I'm really excited to see what you have to tell us about it. I also, for a brief time, worked at the National Canal Museum in Easton, and I have an artifact from that time, which is something that you share. Tell us about what I'm holding here.
Well, I have one too. I'll show you mine also. This is a conch shell, and this is something I'm going to talk about a little bit in the presentation too. But what it was used for is canal captains, when they were coming upon a lock or an inclined plane, they wanted the tenders to know they were coming, so they didn't have to wait. So when they were about a half a mile before getting there, they would do this.
They have a little out of practice.
Yeah.
Been on the canal.
It doesn't happen when you want it to. But anyway, that could be heard up to a half mile. And if you were a tender, you would quickly run to your station to bring the boats through, because time is money for a canal boat captain. They didn't want to have to wait.
So how did you first come to know about the canals?
Well, I've spent my whole life in northern New Jersey, and I always heard about the Morris Canal, but it really was not something that was taught in school. Out here, where I grew up in Morristown, was a big Revolutionary War town. So a lot of what we were taught, George Washington, the Revolutionary War, they didn't really go into a lot about canals. And even to this day, I hear that it's not really taught in school. But I grew up on boats, so I'm fascinated by water navigation and the fact that you could actually navigate across northern New Jersey at one time, and that this canal went through a lot of towns that I was familiar with and even lived in a couple at one time. And to this day, people who've lived in towns for 10 years will say, no idea we had a canal that went practically through my backyard. And that was my experience too.
Right, because unlike the Erie or the Delaware and Raritan, which still have water in them, but the Erie is still quite active, the Morris Canal, there are places where there's almost no trace left, except that here's a village in an odd spot in the hillside, or these buildings are all along. There's this open space in the middle of this otherwise developed area. So there are shadows if you know where to look for them, but very little that's obvious about the old canal.
That's correct. And one of the things I'm going to talk about today is what's called the Morris Canal Greenway project, which is ongoing, and we're uncovering these places, turning them into parks, preserving the land, uncovering artifacts like remains of canals, and letting people know about it. So part of the goal today is not only to teach a little history and educate people, but hopefully get them excited that if the audience has the opportunity to come out to New Jersey, there's a lot of sights to see.
And what a great, as I understand, we're approaching a bicentennial for this canal, isn't that right?
Yeah, you're right. It was conceived in 1822, so coming up to the 200th anniversary of its conception, and it was abandoned 100 years later, so we're coming up to the centennial of its abandonment. So kind of two big anniversaries in reality.
Well, let's get into it. I know you've got some images you want to share with our audience.
Okay. Do you see my PowerPoint screen?
Yeah, where it says something about the inception and a
That's
picture of a
correct.
river
Okay.
taking- Oh,
So the Morris Canal actually begins with a legend. A man named George McCullough. And if you've ever been to Morristown, New Jersey, he was a very prominent, wealthy businessman there. He has a big house, McCullough Hall. The legend is that around 1822, he was fishing on Lake Hopatcong, and he came up with the idea of using the water from Lake Hopatcong to feed a canal going across northern New Jersey. Now, why did we need a canal? Well, we have this kind of long-winded quote from him, which is written in kind of early 19th century verbiage. But what it basically says is there is this large supply of anthracite coal out in the mountains of Pennsylvania, but and to use this coal would be a lot more convenient than either using wood because wood resources were becoming depleted. Wood burns very fast, as anyone who's had a fire know, and certainly more convenient than importing it from Europe, which he calls Liverpool coal. The problem is, how do we transport it from Pennsylvania to the cities in the east, like Newark and Elizabeth, and even New York City? Roads at the time were very poor condition, and basically paths through the woods, and a horse and cart could only pull so much. So water transportation was the answer, and that's why in the early 19th century canals were really taken off. So the first thing that was needed was to raise the level of Lake Hopatcong. Now, if we look at this map from 1778, there's actually a survey from 1769.
let me just
Um,
ask a question for just a moment here. So why is Lake Hopatcong significant why does that make a difference for the canal?
it was the biggest lake at the time, and it's also at the summit of northern New Jersey. So it was at the highest place where you can feed the canal on both sides.
Right, so you have a way of putting water into the canal that will eventually dribble out at either end.
Exactly.
Got
Feed it going north and feed it going west and feed it going east.
it, got it.
Now, to provide enough water, it had to be raised. So from the 1778 map, we see it was actually two bodies of water. There was what was called Hopatcong Pond. It was also called Great Pond. And then a small little body of water called Little Pond up here. The southern point was the Musconetcong River, which has existed for 12,000 years. When it was dammed, the level was raised 5 feet, but it created the lake that we know it today. And this is a modern image of Lake Hopatcong. And first of all, connected the two bodies of water. This was what was originally Little Pond. It extended the main lake out to these coves here, this coves up here, and it extended the southern part down to here where it is today. So this is modern Lake Hopatcong. There are rumors, or not rumors, but it's stated that Hopatcong is a Lenni Lenape word for lake of many coves or honey water of many coves. That is untrue. It does not translate to that. In fact, most of the coves we see today did not exist back in the time of the native people. They were created when the Morris Canal was created. Now, to finance the canal, a private company was created. It's called the Morris Canal and Banking Company. It was created in 1824, and $2 million worth of capital were raised to finance the canal. Back then, that was a lot more than today. Probably 2 million wouldn't even give you the plans today. But that raised the initial capital to build the canal, and the Morris Canal and Banking Company kept it going for 100 years. It also caused Mr. McCullough to disassociate himself with the canal. Now, the reason is, as a wealthy person, as many wealthy people at the time, he did not trust banks. He thought they were crooked, and he wanted nothing to do with a banking company. So he took a powder very early on, and that was really good financial decision because even though this company kept the canal going for 100 years, it only made a profit for several years during 1860s, which was the heyday. The other times it was operated as a loss.
Huh.
Now the canal opened November 4th, 1831, but it did not go all the way across the state at that point. It went from Phillipsburg on the Delaware River up to the summit here in Lake Hopatcong, and then down to Newark and ended at Newark. Now, it took another 5 years to complete it across to Jersey City. Why did it take so long? That's really a short distance. And you can see here, there's this V between Newark and Jersey City. And even though that's totally flat, the Palisades ledge goes underground there. So if you know about the Palisades, there are these big cliffs along the Hudson River farther north, but they continue underground. So that as they were digging the canal east, they hit this ledge and they had to keep going south so they could find a way around it to continue to Jersey City. And a number of places in the canal, like here and over here, you'll see these V's, and it's where they kind of hit something underground and they had to
I've always
around
found
it.
that absolutely remarkable that they, especially, I think they call that the fiddler's elbow there in
Yes,
Bayonne, Jersey City. And not only that they went to all that effort of going at all the work of going that long distance to avoid the extra effort of digging through that very hard rock or building locks to get through it, but also that has continuing, I mentioned in the beginning that we have these towns, particularly in Warren County, I think of these little villages that sort of are really oddly placed in the middle of these fields because they're near where the Morris Canal used to run. And then we see in the same place at the bottom of the Fiddler's Elbow, there's a bridge there in this map, and the Lehigh Valley Railroad ran through there. There's highways that go through there. That geology continues to have an effect on the way we live today.
right. Now, years later, when they built the railroad, they only had to worry about what was on top of the ground. With the canal, you have to worry about what's underneath too. But going back to what he said about these villages, one thing you may notice, the bottom here, we have the 6 counties that the canal went through and all the different municipalities. We have villages called Port Colden, Port Murray. In Roxbury Township, there's Port Morris, and Wharton was originally called Port Orem. The port came about because of the canal. These villages were far inland, 30, 40 miles. They were nowhere near the coast. The port refers to the canal that came through here. So that's
Right.
why I'm
Another
sure.
one of these ghosts of the canal where you wouldn't, why are these inland towns called port? I love that.
Exactly. That's why. And there's probably people today who don't know that. What,
Sure.
why am I living in Port Murray where we're nowhere near the coast? That's why the canal went through there. It was a port. And usually if it's named port, it exists because of the canal. It wouldn't be there except it was built for the canal. Now, there was a big, big challenge for to building the Morris Canal that didn't exist for other canals, and that's referred to as the New Jersey Highlands. And if you've not heard the term, the New Jersey Highlands is the part of New Jersey in the northwest part that is part of the Appalachian Mountain chain. And I live on one of those. I live on Schooley's Mountain, which is right here. And a lot of people don't know that you're the Appalachian Mountains in New Jersey. If I go out of state and say, yeah, hi, I'm from New Jersey, I live on top of an Appalachian Mountain, they'll look at me like I'm a little strange, but that is actually true. And the Morris Canal had to climb these mountains. That's why it was referred to as the mountain climbing canal. That had never been done before. And if you look at the figures at the bottom here, move this out of the way, Mr. McCullough had originally estimated that all told, the canal would have to overcome 300 feet of elevation. You can see he was way, way off. The total elevation change was 1,674 feet. Now, the way we get that is the Lake Hopatcong, which is a summit, is 914 feet above sea level. So to get from tidewater in the east to Lake Hopatcong is 914 feet. Then you have another 760 feet from Lake Hopatcong down to the Delaware Basin. So all told, 1,674 feet. So how are we going to overcome that elevation? Well, for small elevation change, the conventional method is used, and that's locks. Locks are very common. You visit pretty much any canal, you'll see a lock, and most of you have seen them or maybe even navigated through one. But they're very simple. You have 2 walls on each side, a wall on each side. You have gates on each end of the canal, and you have valves that let the water in and out. So if you're raising a boat up, after the boat goes in and you close the gate, if you're raising a boat up, you open the valves at the upper level, it lets water into the lock, and the water level raises up, and that also raises the boat up. If you're lowering the boat, then you open valves at the foot of the lock that lowers the water and lowers the boats down. Once you reach equilibrium on both sides, you can open the gates and the boats are on the way.
Right. So in this image on the left, we're looking down on the lock, and upstream is to the left. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Right,
And
so
that's why these are called wing walls. So that kind of helps the boat get into the
and then
lock.
we have the gates are the two. It almost looks like the paddles on a pinball machine, and so they come together at an angle facing upstream, and I gather the water helps to hold them closed. And then so these the wickets or the little gates there are the way the water comes through those gates, the way you fill and empty the lock. Are there gates inside those gates or on the side of the lock wall? Help me understand how that's happening.
There are valves underwater, and by manipulating these controls here, that opens the valves underwater that let the water out slowly, so it slowly lowers the boats down. So a lock of about 10 feet would take approximately 10 minutes to lower the water. So you got about a foot a minute is what it comes out to.
And do modern locks like the Erie Barge Canal, do they operate on basically the same principle today?
All the locks are the same basic principle. They might be a little bit different in practice, but yeah, principally they're the same. I was visiting the Barge Canal last year up in Erie Canal, and actually rode a tourist boat through a canal, through a lock rather, much bigger one that can fit a number of boats. And yeah, it worked the exact same principle. On the upper lock, a lot of times you have drop gates, which are gates that just pull up and drop down. When they're up, the water pressure on the upside of the canal keeps them closed tight. When you drop the water so they're the same level on the both sides, then you can just push I'm sorry, when you raise the water up so it's equal on both sides, then you can just push the drop gate down. And we'll see a picture, a little bit, a photo of a woman who's working as a lock tender who's just kind of easing that drop gate down to get it to drop.
Great. And Andrew mentions in the chat there's a similar kind of ideas and physics going on with the dry docks and the graving docks at the Brooklyn Navy Yard that we've talked about in other programs. And Richard talks about you can navigate from Quebec City to New York City with Lake Champlain and the canals up there. So lots of people out there watching who have got some familiarity with canals. This is great.
Growing up, we had a 36-foot cabin cruiser. When I was 7, we traveled from the Jersey Shore up to Montreal, which was up the Hudson and through the St. Lawrence Seaway. And so we went through some very, very big locks with huge ships. So imagine being on a 36-foot boat where you have one side, this wall going up hundreds of feet, and the other side, this huge ship. It was kind of intimidating for a little kid, to say the least.
That's great.
Okay, so here's a couple of historic photos. There's tons and tons of historic photos on the internet of the Morris Canal. I'm going to show you just a few today because we could spend hours looking at photos. But
and I have to say, your website for the Canal Society is fantastic. I highly recommend people check that out. Lots of great photos there.
Thank you. The first, the one on top is a lock. It's lock 2 east of Wharton, and what we're seeing here is a boat going through the lock. We see all the people are busy doing something. Here's the lock tender operating the machinery. Here's the captain opening the mule feed box, and here's the mule tender coming forward to feed the mules. See the mules in the background. So as these boats were going through, that would be a good opportunity to feed your mules during that 10 minutes. Then we have these 2 young ladies here who are obviously on an errand. They have a picnic basket and a jug. And we have kind of a debate going on in the Canal Society, who they are. Are they the children of the captain, or they're about to get on the boat and go on their way? Or are they just 2 passerbys who stopped to watch the boat go through? We don't know. Now, if you see on the cabin of the boat, here's this round object. And usually I do this as a mystery and say, okay, but we know already that is this, which is a conch shell that he must have just blown about a half mile before to alert the lock tender that he is coming. The
And
bottom
why
we have
these
other
conch shells? It seems like they're not growing in the Delaware or in New York Harbor, are they?
conch shells. You would find them on the shore, on the the shore up by New York City.
Oh,
I
really?
mean,
Okay.
well, today it's all developed, but this is early 1800s. You still had a lot of beach there, so they would find in the eastern parts of the canal. The photo at the bottom, Lock 1 East and Ledgewood. Um, and this just shows, if you're familiar with Ledgewood at all, today this is all highways and strip malls and fast food places. And this is actually a little park called Riggs Park, 5-acre park that's kind of right in the armpit of two major highways amongst all that urban development. But back then it was very bucolic, as you can see. And this is actually a work scow going through. It's much smaller than a cargo boat. And again, the mules are eating and they're taking a break as the boat goes through. All right, so locks were good for overcoming elevations up to about 10 feet. What happens if you had a much bigger elevation change, say 90 feet? Well, you can do what this is called, which is a flight of locks. It's basically stacking locks up like stairs, a flight of stairs. And that is been used, and the Erie Canal has a lock flight. But there's a logistical problem with that. If it takes you 10 minutes to go through each lock, locks are about 10 feet in height, and you have 90 feet, you're going to have 90 locks. That means it's going to take you 90 minutes to get through that flight of locks. That's an hour and a half to overcome 90 feet. Mile down the canal, you have another 60 feet, and that's another hour. That's going to add a lot of time to your journey. So with all the elevation changes in the Morris Canal, that's going to really make your journey very long, longer than you want. So they had to come up with another solution. Now, this flight of locks we see here is actually in England. It's a canal where they have 29 locks overcoming 237 feet of elevation. And you can see it takes more than 5 hours to traverse this lock flight. So the Morris Canal, they threw this idea away very quickly, and they said, we have to come up with a better idea for overcoming large changes in elevation. And they did. And this is what they came up with in the inclined plane. The inclined plane was first used on the Morris Canal. The Morris Canal was the only place within the whole United States where it was used. And it spawned inclined planes to be built many places elsewhere, other canals in the world. Now, simply put, the way an inclined plane works is you have railroad tracks, the boat has a cradle, the boat goes into the cradle, and it's pulled up and down the hill using cables. Now, the
It's
first
effectively a
design
freight
is,
railway, like the East River. They were using a similar sort of idea to pull boats out of the water to repair them before they had
yes,
dry docks.
yes,
So the basic idea was out there. They just took it to a whole other level.
yes, they did. I don't, was that in use as early as the 1820s?
Yeah, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah,
Now, the original design they had for the inclined plane used a big water wheel. That's what they started out with, kind of like the water wheel you'd see in a grist mill. And that worked, but it was a limited in capacity. You could only pull boats that fully loaded were about 20 tons. As time went on, we got into the 1840s, the demand for coal greatly increased because now we were getting into the Industrial Revolution and the demand to transport it increased. So they needed more boats and bigger boats and more cargo. So this is when they totally redesigned the inclined plane. And what you see in the middle was the final design, which was started in the 1850s and continued all the way to the abandonment in 1920s. And the way it works is you have a big Scotch turbine here buried about 40 feet underground. And to get an idea of the size, you see this one here. This is at Hopatcong State Park. That's me standing next to it, so you can see how large it is. And the water would come from the upper canal down this pipe called the penstock, and it would turn the turbine. That would turn this wheel in the powerhouse, and that would pull the cable that would pull the cradles up and down the inclined plane. In the bottom here, you see a schematic of how the cable system worked. This is actually a schematic for a double track plane, which only 3 of the 23 had double tracks. Most were single tracks. That meant one boat had to go up, then take turns, another boat go down, and so on. If you had a double track plane, then one boat could go up while the other went down.
That brings up some questions. People are wondering about the width of the canal and how canal boats passed, which I believe you'll get into shortly. But it's really impressive to see the scale and the complication of how they're operating. Someone else noted that this reminded them of funicular, like the inclined planes that are famous ones of Pittsburgh and other steeply sided places that have commuter rails that are sort of inclined elevators run by cables on tracks. Kind of a similar idea, yeah?
Yes, it is. In fact, all the 23 inclined planes used nothing but water power. There was one small inclined plane built very, very late in the canal's 1909 history, and it was in Newark, and it was actually an electric inclined plane. That was the only one that didn't use water power, and that was because they raised a railroad track, so it was not in street level, so it wouldn't collide with the trolley that was there, and they had to get the canal over the rail, and they built an electric inclined plane there. That was the only one in the Morris Canal that didn't use water power. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple historic photos of the inclined plane. The top one was Plane 7 East in Boonton. What we're seeing here is the boat has just floated onto the cradle. The cradle goes all the way into the water. The boat floats out onto it, and it's just starting to be pulled up the inclined plane. You can see the water line here. Now, what was used to pull the cradle up was the Roebling cable. It was about that thick, and that was used in the latter part of the canal.
Roebling cable? Is that like George Washington Roebling? What do you mean by Roebling cable?
Roebling was the person who it was a company that manufactured the cable. So it was woven cable, and it was very, very thick. Now, prior to that, they used chain, and chain had a tendency to break. Now, there's kind of an amusing story that took place in Boonton. Back when they were using chain, a boat was being pulled up the inclined plane, got about 3/4 of the way up, and the chain broke. That caused the boat to go sliding backward very fast, splash into the water, and end up on the bank of the river. It was a little bit scary because the captain's wife and children were in the cabin at the time. So they went down there, they pulled the wife and children out, and they said, "Are you all right?" And they were okay. And they said to the captain's wife, "That must have been very frightful for you, madam." And her response was, "Well, I thought it was moving rather swiftly, but I just figured that was the way the thing worked." So she thought that was just a normal operation of an inclined plane. But once they had started using the Roebling cable, they didn't have that problem anymore. The bottom photo.
If the Roebling cables, is that also the Brooklyn Bridge Roebling?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Same type of interwoven cable used for that.
And
may not
what
be
about
as thick
the
though.
capacity of these inclined planes? How much were they we've got this water powered winch and this cable. What kind of loads were they carrying on them?
Up to fully loaded, a boat could weigh up to 120 tons.
120 tons.
Yeah.
Wow.
The boats themselves were about 120 tons empty. So add another 100 tons of cargo, and yeah, you had about 120 tons that we pulled up these inclined planes. The photo at the bottom, this is a captain's eye view. This is actually an inspection boat going down an inclined plane, plane 5 East in Wharton. So this is what the captain would see. The inclined planes overcame elevations. The smallest one was 33 feet, and the largest one was 98 feet. And when I did the calculation based on using inclined planes versus if you had used flights of locks, the savings in time was over 18 hours for each trip. And a trip took 5 days across the state. So that's, significant amount of time. Okay, so what happened well, the inclined plane was considered an engineering marvel. And once it was built in the Morris Canal, engineers from all over the world came to take a look at it. And then they built it in Europe, they built them in Japan, they were used everywhere. Ironically, there are no functional inclined planes that exist on canals in the US anymore. There are ones in other places. This one is the Elblag Canal in Poland. It's still in operation and it's a tourist attraction. You can go there, get on a boat and ride an inclined plane up. Now, the gentleman who is the head of this canal society just last year made a trip to New Jersey because he knew this is where it was all started. And he actually traveled all across the state from one end to the other to view the sites of all the inclined planes in the Morris Canal, because he knew that it, had significance to his canal too. And so we met him. He did a very good program at our program meeting and didn't speak any English. So it was quite an adventure for him to travel across the state. A few times people called the police on him, but once he explained what he was doing.
Why did they call the police on him?
Just because, the strange man poking around. The canal ran all kinds of places. I do that myself going across the state. And sometimes you're not exactly sure where the public accessible land and private land. So I might be like behind a gas station poking around in the woods. Look a little suspicious, especially if you're around like schools. Now, if I investigate a place by a school, I usually do it on a Saturday or weekend because, teachers are going to get a little suspicious when they see a strange man around school children. So just things like that.
Well, it speaks a lot to how much the canal has disappeared, both physically and in the consciousness of the public. And hopefully the work that your society does will help to change that.
Yeah, and that's what we'll talk about a little bit later on.
Great.
So each, as kind of mentioned earlier, each lock and plane had a tender. That was someone who was employed by the canal company to operate these locks and inclined planes. Now, they were typically family affairs, so they could be men, women, children. Here we see a photo, Lock 2 East in Mount Olive. This was called Fluke's Lock. Mr. Fluke actually worked on a work scout during the day, so he allowed his wife and 4 daughters to run the lock. So it was an all-female run lock. This is one of the Fluke daughters. And this is what I talked about earlier, a drop gate. When the water's low, the water behind you will keep it closed, the water pressure. Once it's raised to equilibrium, you could drop it down again. You just need a little nudge to get it going. That's what she's doing.
Sometimes a big nudge. We had one at the National Canal Museum in Easton. It got pretty sticky, but our mule driver had some serious upper body strength, and she got that down without much trouble.
Yeah, and that's at the Lehigh Canal, they actually have a real canal boat pulled by mules there, and they have a great museum. So that's a great trip, and that's they're partners with us. They're good friends of ours. And they also the tenders were also provided houses to live in by the canal company, but located very close to the locks and planes. A lot of them still exist today as private residences. This is the house at Brooklyn Lock at Hopatcong State Park. That's the same place where you saw the huge turbine. It's now the Lake Hopatcong Museum, Historical Museum. So if you do a trip to Hopatcong State Park, you can see the big turbine and the old tender's house. Once we're past the pandemic, if you can go there when the museum's open. It's a really good museum to visit. Okay, so I mentioned that Lake Hopatcong was the main water source. There are all kinds of secondary water sources like rivers and creeks. And in many cases, the canal had to cross the river. So how would it get across the river? Where in most cases, the boats would navigate across, which might seem pretty simple, but you needed a few things to do that. First of all, you needed a dam to create slack water because you cannot pull a boat across against the current. So just downriver, this upper picture is a dam. You would also need a mule bridge because the mule and tender had to get across the river. And then you see in the bottom, you need a guard lock. And a guard lock served 2 purposes. It controlled the amount of water in the canal because if you just had a free-flowing water into the canal, it would overflow. But it also allowed the boats to go through because if you had a current going either one way or the other, it would be hard to pull the boat through. So it controlled the water and allowed the boats to pass through. This is at Waterloo Village. We're seeing a boat that just came down the canal, inclined plane. It's coming out of the cradle. The mules are going to pull it across the river. And here on the other side of the river, it's going through the lock and continuing on its way west along the canal. Now, if you don't know, Waterloo is a completely preserved canal village today. If you go there, and we'll see the same picture a little bit later on, it looks pretty much the same. The big difference is all these open fields you see on the left are thick woods, and that is why, one of the reasons why they needed the canal, because the depletion of the forestry dried up the wood supplies they needed to transport coal.
And that's true for so much of the East Coast. We think of the woods, we see them now, and we think they've always been there. But yeah, most of the last 200 years, it's been pretty bare.
Now, the canal, a lot of the canal came down the Lehigh Canal from Hopatcong, which today we know is Jim Thorpe. So as it came down the Lehigh, which is over here, it would have to get across the Delaware River. Now, a bigger river like the Delaware would not be practical to build a dam because you would be, inhibiting other larger boats. So they had to come up with another way to get across the Delaware. And the way they did that is by stringing a cable across the river and then using the current to get the boat across. So, for example, the boat was going from Pennsylvania to New Jersey. The cable would be higher on the Pennsylvania side. You would attach the boat to the cable and ride the current across to New Jersey. If you were going from New Jersey the other way, then you would make the boat, the cable lower from the New Jersey side, you ride the current the other way. That's how it got across here, going from Easton to Phillipsburg, also down for the DNR between New Hope and Lambertville. It used the exact same
And
method.
what about the mules? Would they be on the canal boat? Would you use different mules on the Lehigh navigation than you did on the Morris Canal?
No, the mules never got on to the Morris Canal boats, and we'll see a little bit later. The boats were too small. They would have to cross a road bridge across. There's a road bridge, you can't see it upriver.
The free bridge, which was a covered bridge at that time, that's a long hike for those mules.
It is a long, but well, mules and tenders walk 20 miles a day, so it was just part of the thing. But yes, as the boat's going across, the mules would have to cross upriver and then come back down to meet the boat. Same with down at New Hope. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it would have to go up to where the bridges that crosses from New Hope to Lambertville, and then back down again to meet the boats.
Got an interesting question from Richard. Wants to know about how high was this cable off the water? Would that be a hazard to navigation?
It would be high enough to not impede other boats going across.
My understanding is there wasn't a lot of navigation. There were definitely, you had logs, that log rafts that were coming down from logging. There was an attempt at steam navigation very briefly in the late 19th century that ended disastrously. But there a huge explosion near the Bushkill Creek. But yeah, I'm not aware of much bigger than a canal boat navigating in that area. Are you?
No, not this high up on the Delaware. You would not have really big, steamship like you would down by Philadelphia, for example. So yeah, they would be smaller boats. But you still had some boats, boats that were much higher than a Morris Canal boat, where you'd have to provide some level of clearance for them to get out, get under.
Great.
Now, if the canal ran higher than the river, then you employed aqueducts. Aqueducts were like water bridges. And, if you go to the DNR, you'll see existing aqueducts today. These were the two most impressive of the aqueducts in the Morris Canal. The upper one was Lincoln Park, so it spanned from Morris County to Passaic County. And it was the longest aqueduct at 275 feet. It's no longer there, but if you explore the shore line on either side of the river, you will find the remains of the abutment for this aqueduct. The one on the bottom was the Little Falls Aqueduct, which was the most impressive of any object on the Morris Canal. It was also the largest man-made object on the Morris Canal. Right shortly after the canal abandonment in the 1920s, this was blown up. It was crumbling. They put a bunch of dynamite in it and blew it up, and it took several attempts. And but that's what happened to it. Today, if you visit, there's a Morris Canal Park in Little Falls. You can see the site, and there's now a big water line that goes across it at the same site. So that's a neat place to visit. Very nice park they have there.
It's a beautiful bridge, kind of a heartbreaking loss, but that it was in such bad condition makes it a little easier to take. And just so you know, we have about 15 minutes left now. I know you have a lot of photos you want to share.
Okay, I'll try to go a little bit faster. Morris Canal boats. So the boats were designed specifically for the Morris Canal. They were 90 feet long, 45 feet each section, 2 hinge sections. And the reason they were in 2 hinge sections is because going over the top of the inclined plane, they had to be able to bend, as you see here. Otherwise, they would break. They would
one question about that I've always been a little bit confused about. You call them hinge boats. Do they stay connected when they're on those 2 cradles, or what exactly is happening there?
Yeah, they stay connected. Let me go back to that slide. They stay connected, but as you notice, the cradle is also in 2 sections. So you have to maneuver the boat so the hinge section is also over the hinge section of the cradle.
Right, and that needs to be a pretty big space. Those hinges must have been pretty big to give enough flex that they can get over the top. We also had a question, if you can just specify a little bit about how the aqueduct worked.
Okay, let me go back to that slide. The aqueduct worked. It was a bridge, and there would be a trough in there. The canal was 5 feet deep, so you didn't need a lot of water. And so the canal would connect up to a trough of water going over this bridge. And then you had a little passageway along the water where the mules would walk and pull the boats along. I'll have to update this to show a picture like inside the
like we saw in the Waterloo Village. It wasn't super clear because it's so the size of the sides of the canal are so close to the sides of the boat. It's a little hard to tell that there's that it's in water there and going over a bridge. But
yeah, here's the this is the lock, and the Waterloo lock was actually unique. The stone wall, usually they're all stone walls. Part of it was a little tiny aqueduct made of wood, and that's because this creek you see here was a tail race of a forge that predated the canal. So here you see a little example of an aqueduct where the water continued and it went over to connect to the other part of the canal. So just imagine that extending on for 275 feet, but it's the same principle.
And we do have a question I think you'll answer if we have time to get to it, about the living quarters. Yeah, we guess right here.
Okay, here we go right here. Each canal boat had a little cabin. It was only 10 by 10 feet. It just had 2 bunks, a tiny little stove, and table. That was the only place where you could sleep. So you might have a canal family of wife and husband and 6 kids living in that cabin. But pretty much everything they did it was on deck. All they did, other than sleep in the cabin, they spent most of the time on deck. And I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. But real quick, the boats had a 10.5-foot beam, meaning their width. The dimensions of the locks were 95 by 11 feet. So you could see how tight a fit it was. You only had inches on each side. It was quite a job to navigate into these locks. Now, the other thing I'll show you, here's the tiller and rudder. You see this rope here. That's because how far the boat was in the water varied on how much cargo it was carrying. This is a light boat, so it's very high up. So the rudder would be farther down. When you loaded the boat up, the water would come up above here. Then you had to cinch up this rope to bring the rudder up.
So what was the maximum draft typically?
Well, about 4.5 feet, because the canal was only 5 feet deep. They were flat bottom. Now, to navigate the boat, it took minimum 2 people. You had a captain steering the boat, and that's why we refer to it as a boat rather than a barge, because it was navigated. And then you had the mule driver or tender who would bring the mules along. Now you see, here's the mules and tender's over here. He's not paying much attention to them. The reason mules are used rather than horses because they tend to be very intelligent. And once you got them going, they would go on their own. They also didn't like water. So whereas a horse might jump in the water if it got hot, the mules wouldn't do that. So the mule driver kept the mules moving, but didn't really need to do a whole lot, didn't need to be there with the mules right away.
And yes, Chris, these are flat-bottomed boats. Catherine wants to know how many mules do you would you need, and how much can they pull?
Team of two mules, and they pulled fully loaded the boat with 120 tons. So the hard work was getting them going. Once the boat was going, then it was pretty easy to keep along. It was
Keep the tow line up and let the weight of the tow line kind of pull the boat along.
exactly. Mule tenders were typically young men. Here we see a young man as young as 10 or 12 years old, who would lead the mules along. Here we see they're about to pull a boat out of a lock. They would walk 20 miles a day, but it could also be young men or young ladies. If a canal boat captain had sons or daughters, he would employ either one as a mule tender. Here we have two women. We know about these women because in 1970s, James Lee, who was kind of the granddaddy of the whole canal, Morris Canal historic effort, conducted interviews with people who worked on the canal as kids. At this point, they were older people. These two women were both daughters of canal boat captains. Mrs. Van Home was a daughter of an African American canal boat captain named James Campbell. Mrs. Mann was a daughter of Captain Peter Langstrom. And they both talked about what it was like. They had to walk 20 miles a day, leading these mules along, and how there was this whole extended canal family amongst the canal boat captains. So you see a quote from Mrs. Van Horn. She said, "Canals helped one another. They were good kind. They were poor people that had the boats, but they were very kind to each other, very good to each other." And Mrs. Mann talks about how when they were coming through Washington Borough, they had a mule died. So what did they do? They borrowed off Mr. Jim Campbell, who was Mrs. Van Horn's father. So that was his extended family that existed amongst canalers along the Morris Canal. And fortunately, we have the interview with these two women to tell us what it was like for them as children to work as mule drivers.
We had a question before while we have that slide fresh in our memory. I can't recommend highly enough the Tales the Boatmen Told, the really fantastic oral history book. And we had a question I saw a moment ago and have lost. Oh yes, could they ride the mules? Could the mule drivers, did they have to walk the whole time, or could they ride the mule?
No, it's funny that you should ask that, because in the interview with Mrs. Van Horn, she says that sometimes, yes, she would get up on a mule and ride it, but it all depended on what the mule would let you do. You hear the saying, stubborn as a mule. Stubbornness is actually intelligence. A mule won't do anything it doesn't want you to do. So to ride the mule, you had to have the right kind of mule to let you do it. And you had to be a pretty light person because they weren't as big and, sturdy as a horse was. So yes, that was.
For the people who still look after the mules that work on the National Canal Museum. I understand Ray Rush once tried to get on and ride Dixie, the mule, when I was working there, and he got bucked off in no time at all.
Yes.
We've got a lot of great questions coming in here. What about resting? Well, a couple of questions about stopping. Were there resting spots for the tenders and captains? And what about tolls? Where were there tolls collected?
Yeah, the toll booth was the main toll booth that you paid for the Morris Canal Banking Company was located in Phillipsburg. If we go back to the slide of the Delaware River, there was actually a toll booth right there.
That's not a picture I've seen before, so I'm really excited about this painting. That's great.
Actually, the toll is off the picture here, but as you came into the Morris Canal, right here, there was a toll office that you would pay a toll to. You also pay tolls at each lock and incline plane. Resting areas, there are basins all along the canal. You would have to stop overnight because the locks and inclined planes close down at sunset. So typically you would stop at a basin. And also the canal didn't run on Sunday. and basins were usually located where you had canal stores, blacksmith shops, boat repair shops, or they might have been right in the middle of a town like Dover had a big basin right in the middle of it. Okay, this picture, now earlier I said that most of what they did took place on deck. This is a great photo that shows life on a canal boat. We see a woman cooking on the canal deck, on the canal boat deck. Here's the top of the stove. She's frying something in the pan. She has linen drying here, pot of water to boil water, either for cooking or washing. Here's her basket that she'd take in the stores to buy things. And this was a typical day on a canal boat. She's doing this on the hinges of the boat because the space on the hinges between the two feed boxes is where you had the most amount of deck space. So if you weren't actually navigating the boat, that's probably where you'd be washing and cleaning and cooking and doing stuff like that. The
We have just about 5 minutes left here, but we also had a question about schooling. How did the kids in these families get to go to school?
They were either homeschooled, or it could be a case where only the captain would go out during the school year, leave the wife and kids at home, and hire a tender to tend the mules. Because remember, in the summer, that's when it stays really light from very early in the morning to very late at night. So that's where you need the most people. So he might take his family out during the summer, so his wife could take the tiller for a while, his kids can drive the mules, and so on.
And during the winter, the canal was closed, right?
It closed once the water froze up.
Yeah.
But we do have photos of the canal boat still going when there's snow on the ground, so they would go pretty late.
Wow.
Okay, so the captain typically rented the boat from the Morris Canal Banking Company. Here we see him fixing a leak while they're in dry dock on a cradle. But the captain had to provide the mules. Those were his. A team of mules would cost $150, which back then would be an exorbitant amount of money to pay for it. So he took great care of his mules because this was his bread and butter. And hopefully a team of mules might last you 20 years if you were lucky. There are a number of canal stores along the way. The boats had no refrigeration, very little storage. So these are two typical canal stores, Waterloo and in Port Murray. And the boats, they were located right on the banks of the canals, so the boats could pull right up and get loaded right into them. Here's another canal store, the King Store in Ledgewood. This reconstruction shows that not only were they a place where they sold a number of goods, but that you could kind of get together around the stove and gossip and drink coffee and do a little socializing while you're waiting. Okay, the decline of the Morris Canal, railroads is what put them out of business. A canal boat took 5 days to get across the state. The railroad only took 5 hours. They could pull much more canal and much more coal. So here we see a picture of the train in the canal, and that's what took over. These are actually passenger boats. This is at Lake Hopatcong, and the boats are going to take passengers from the train up the canal through the feeder into the lake, through the lock here and into the lake to whatever resort they're going on.
But you said the canal ran until 1924. That seems awfully late for the railroads to put them out of business.
In the latter, from about the 1870s on, the railroads and the canal worked in conjunction with each other, depending where you're going. So some cargo would be by train, some cargo would be by boat. It was really within the first 10 years of the 20th century when cargo traffic dried up, but it took another 10 to 15 years before they determined what to do with the canal. And one of the things they were considering, good segue here, was keeping the canal as a water source to supply water to the cities to the east. Now that's why the DNR still exists. It's used as a water source, so it was preserved. The person who led the case for the abandonment was this man here named Hudson Maxim. He owned a great deal of land, very wealthy landowner on the west shore of Lake Hopatcong, and he led the effort to abandon the canal. The reason being that he was afraid if he used the canal as a water source, it's going to deplete the water in the lake, and obviously devalue his land. So he was successful in getting the canal abandoned, among other people too, but mainly him. This is his boathouse. That shows how wealthy he was. If you visit,
we just have a minute left. Can we get a quick glance at what the canal looks like today and how people can interact with it now?
Oh, I'm sorry, I did the wrong thing. Yeah, here's the Morris Canal. I'll start. Here's a couple of watered section, Wharton, Forest Park. Here's Waterloo Village. Very few watered sections that still exist are there. Couple of locks, restored lock in Lock 2 East in Wharton. Here's the lock in Waterloo I told you about. We saw this image before with the open field.
That's where the aqueduct was, where the grass is now.
Inclined Plains, Plain 2 East in Ledgewood, very well preserved. Here's Plain 9 West, which not only a preserved plain, but the plain tender's house. Couple of really good canal stores, Waterloo Village, Smith Store, King Store in Ledgewood. All kinds of trails. This is where, if you go to our website, we have brochures up now with a lot of these trails that you can find. And if you go to Breadlock Park in Warren County, there's a full-size replica canal boat. That's a really good place to go. You can actually walk the deck, see it, and see the cabin. And at Waterloo Village, we have an actual preserved Morris Canal boat we found a few years ago. That's a story in itself. You can go to
definitely check that out. That story is incredible.
And it's about. And if we're open at Waterloo next spring, come out and you could see the preserved Morris Canal boat, and we can tell you the story of it.
And the great thing about a lot of these sites is that they're COVID friendly because they're outdoors. So I do hope
last year they let us open to just peek in the barn. So hopefully we can do that this year.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Tim, and thank you for sharing ways to contact with you and the organization. I hope folks will, and if you'll stop sharing your screen, we'll just talk for 2 seconds here, but I do hope folks will consider supporting the Canal Society here at the end of the year and the other organizations, Waterloo Village, Plain 9, as we're trying to support our nonprofits who are struggling like all the other folks in this pandemic, and go out there and engage with the Morris Canal and get to know it better. Thank you again, Tim, for taking the time to share this with us.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for having me. Any additional questions you can get to in the audience, tim.roth@canalsocietyNJ.org.
And we'll be sending all that out in our follow-up email. So
okay, sounds great.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Stay safe.